is ended. Sorry, hate this podcast.
This is Antic, the Atari 8-Bit podcast. I'm Kay Savetz. Anne Lewin-Benham was executive director of the Capitol Children's Museum in Washington, D.C. The museum was home to the first public access computer center in the nation's capital, and indeed one of the first in the United States. In 1981, Atari and Apple each donated dozens of computers to the museum. The exact number is unclear, but 30 is the number I've seen most often for Atari's contribution. The computer lab was called the Future Center. There, the museum offered computer literacy classes for people of all ages, from Compu-Tots for preschoolers to programming classes for adults. There was even a computer literacy session for members of Congress. The museum also used the lab for birthday parties. Last year, I interviewed a woman who had her 8th birthday party at the museum. The museum used more of its computers in its exhibit on communication. It established a software development laboratory called Superboots, in which developers created custom software for the museum, and one product that was released commercially, the graphics program Paint. In a 1982 article titled A Day at the Capitol Children's Museum, Melanie Graves described the scene. My 12-year-old friend Sarah and I went to the museum to explore the computers. There are several dozen computers scattered throughout the building, which are used for exhibits, classroom teaching, and the development of educational software. A machine that calls itself Wisecracker is the noisiest of the computers that beckon visitors to the communication exhibit. "My name is Wisecracker," it says in monotone. "Come type to me." This message repeats endlessly until someone types at the keyboard or turns off the computer. "Hello, how are you?" Sarah typed, and pressed the return key. "Hello, how are you?" the machine's voice responded. Sarah typed for a while longer and then proclaimed, "It sure is dumb, but its voice is kind of cute." The computer next to Wisecracker has a database program that asks Sarah her name, where she came from, and other questions. It informed her that she was the 37th person from Virginia to type in data that day. 55% of the people who came here were girls, she told me. Next to the database, a computer is set up with a music program. Sarah pressed some random keys, causing notes to sound. At the same time, the letter names of the notes appeared on the keys of a piano that was displayed on the screen. There is also a teletext terminal that tells inquirers about weather predictions and news releases, the latest acquisitions at the public library, local cultural events, and whatever else has been entered into the database for that day. After playing with teletext, Sarah and I went to the Future Center, a room equipped with 20 Atari 800s. On weekdays, the classroom is available to school groups ranging from pre-kindergarten to high school. On weekends, families arrive for courses in programming. Classes have also been created for working people, senior citizens, community groups, congressional spouses, and other special interest groups. This summer, more than 60 students from the Washington, D.C. public schools attended one of 2 free month-long computer camps at the museum. This is a great article. It and several others about the computers at the Capitol Children's Museum are linked from the show notes at ataripodcast.com. This interview with Anne Lewin-Benham took place on April 2nd, 2021.
I got married very young, if you really want to go back that far, 5 days after I graduated from college, and I was 20. And then my first and only child was born about a year and a half later, and it was such a miracle to me to have, to see this perfect miniature human being and then to watch his growth. And in searching for the right school for him, Montessori was just coming to be known in this country at that time. So I took on the administration of a Montessori school, was intrigued, put him in it. That meant when he was 3, we went to school every day together. I was considered quite a pariah by friends in that generation, because in the 60s you didn't put a child of any age in any kind of school. You stayed home as a mother. But he and I could go to school together in the daytime, and I watched 4 classes. My office was in the coat room of a social hall attached to a fire station, and 2 of the classes were fabulous, and 2 of the classes, were just chaotic. And I said, I have to study this, any system that can produce such, directly contradictory results. I need to know more about it. So I took a year-long course in the Montessori method with a incredible British instructor who herself had been trained by Madame Montessori. And my husband looked at my working, and we share an office, and says, "How do you remember all that stuff?" And I said, "I was trained by Margaret Stevenson. I will come back in 6 lives from now and still know how to stack the trinomial cube." So one thing led to another. I never found schools that I felt were worthy of not only my child, but most children. I'm a renegade when it comes to what I want in education. So I founded schools up through a junior high school. And then a couple of close architect friends with whom I'd worked on some of the school design said there was a languishing effort to get a children's museum off the ground in Washington, D.C., and I was like, "A what?" I didn't know about children's museums at that. Nobody really knew about children's museums much at that point. There were only about 9 in the country. The long and the short of it was that I put other stuff on hold and plunged into the project and ended up founding what turned out, what started with no budget and 2 rooms loaned to us by the Board of Education in Washington, D.C., in a way out-of-the-way location. But I don't think we were open for a week before Time magazine found us and put a wonderful color picture in, and people would stagger in clutching a ragged copy of the Time magazine and gasp and say, "We found you." So in those 4 rooms, we entertained first ladies. We had some quote-unquote important Washington people on our board who were high up in the Carter administration at that time. And it was the Camp David Peace Corps Treaty was being talked about. And both Madame Sadat and Mrs. First Lady of Egypt and Mrs. Begin, First Lady of Israel, came at different times and visited us in those 4 rooms. And over the years that the Camp David Peace Treaty took shape, the museum also took shape, because I went to the board and I said, "This won't work. We're overwhelmed. We need a permanent site." And they said, "Fine, go get one." And fortunately, through our connections with Carter's administration, we were introduced to the Secretary of HUD, Patricia Harris, a brilliant woman, lawyer, native of Washington, D.C., who sent 2 of her top henchmen over to see what we were proposing. And she could see instantly that what I was proposing would represent the UD. HUD is Housing and Urban Development. Mm-hmm. And she saw instantly that this children's museum would be the urban development part of HUD. Because what I'd found and what we ultimately occupied was a 3-acre site with 150,000 square feet of old buildings that was on the market for sale. It had been the home of a cloistered and sheltered nuns. They really had been the soup kitchen, if you will, for the neighborhood. But when the city put a overpass over the corridor, they felt very threatened by the intrusion they felt it as an intrusion on their building. So they put it up for sale. Long and short of it was, we bought it, took over this massive, went from 4 rooms to 3 acres, and as I said, 150,000 square feet. And that began what in my life turned out to be about 20 years founding and ultimately running the Children's Museum. So that's, does that give you enough background?
No, that's great. Awesome.
Where I came from?
Yes,
I mean, I saw in that time, I naively hoped that the discovery and self-paced and follow your own interests. I guess that's the most succinct way I can put it. That it was an environment in which children could follow their own interests, which is my deep belief is the way we learn best. It's not when we're kind of sitting in a formulaic lockstep, this is the lesson today. This week the letter is E, and I think that's, early death to the brain of young children, frankly. So I saw the Children's Museum as another way to go about this. What I learned was that children's museums are a remarkable environment in which to learn, but there are qualifications, and children's museums certainly would never replace schools. So while we had this wonderful, huge amount of space, so within that space, ultimately, I opened 2 schools. One was an early childhood center for children from 3 to 6 years old who were from our neighborhood, eligible for Head Start, but the Head Start programs were all full. So working with the public school system, they chose the Head Start eligible students from 6 elementary schools in closest proximity to the museum, and we took the overflow and started an early learning center. And then that same year, there were a lot of problems. DC in that decade was known as the crime capital of the United States. It was a very, very difficult period. It reflected in the schools. My heart goes out to the inner city schools that you try so hard to make a go of it, and they have so much going against them. But anyway, again, working with the superintendent of schools and the school board and all, we started almost concurrently with the early childhood program. We started a dropout prevention program for teenagers. The city selected them. I wanted control over who I hired and what the program would be. I wanted my staff to control the program, but I didn't want to have anything to do with the selection of students. That was completely up to the school system. And in that first year, they were very cynical, and they sent us this is going to sound horrible. In their words, they called the students they sent to us their quote-unquote 100 worst. So we began. I've written 6 books about early childhood, and I have done the interviews for, but have yet to write the book on the story of what we called Options School, the school, for a dropout prevention school that still runs. It's still considered the safety net. They learned after a couple of years. They realized that we really were doing something very special. We did have. It was a very difficult startup, to put it mildly. That will all come out in the book that I intend to write about the school. But we did get a handle on it, and it was that staff was unbelievably remarkable. And as a broadcaster yourself, you'll relate to the fact to this tiny glimpse into that school. But Frank Stasio, who was one of the voices of NPR, and the NPR studios were just about 6 blocks away from us in D.C., Frank left NPR to come and be a full-time teacher in that school. And he said to me one day, he said, Ann, he said, I can go weeks and nothing interesting happens at NPR. He said, but at Option School there are several stories every single day. So that that's just a very quick example of the incredible staff that we had in that school, and the director of that school remains a very close friend. Actually, the director and her 2 assistant directors remain very close, beloved friends from that unusual period. So there's my background.
Okay, so it sounds like you were doing very important work, and you were helping the most in need kids to get school and running this museum. So how did you go from that to let's have a computer lab? That
was early on. That was way before the schools. Well, actually, it seems like it was way before. The computer lab opened in 1981. As an educator, I've always been very concerned about the difficulties that some children have learning to read and write. And I thought, gee, in this wonderful format of hands-on learning, the Children's Museum, let's do something about reading and writing. Well, the something about reading and writing turned into a 2-floor exhibit. I'd have to think hard for a few minutes to figure out what the square footage was. It was a very large exhibit. And ultimately, we went from an Ice Age cave, which, working with the anthropologist John Pfeiffer, we interpreted as an early communications environment. Because the caves, some caves were used to live in, but other caves were used as the scene of ritual, if you will. Because if somebody, if the shaman led a group into the depths of this dark and could be fearful cave, and on the wall, people had painted images, those incredible images from Lascaux and other historic caves of the animals on the walls. By flickering torchlight, they would appear to move. And if, as an animal appears to move in that environment, and a shaman tells you a very dramatic story, and there's evidence that there were flutes that made a very high-pitched, eerie kind of noise that paleoanthropologists found on the floors of those caves, you'd be likely to remember that information. If somebody said, this is dangerous, or think about this, or, don't go there, you'd be likely to remember that life-saving information because of the environment in which you heard it. So the cave was a very dramatic entry, if you will, to this large exhibit that literally came up through the history of communication devices. I mean, we had Greek torches that really, that worked electrically, not with fire, obviously. But we came up through the history of communication, including we had a print workshop where we found historic plans for a Gutenberg-era press, and we created it at 3/4 size so that young children could actually pull the devil's tail on this very dramatic printing press and make their own prints. So it was a completely we had a wonderful little scriptorium where we found a marvelous leaded glass window to enhance the feeling that you were in a monastery, and lit it so that it looked as if a shaft of sunlight was coming through this wonderful window, and there children could print with quill pen and ink. And a donor gave us a wonderful manuscript page, probably circa sometime in the 1500s. So, we try to create every environment in this history of human communication so that it actually reflected the history, and so that there were hands-on things that children could do in that environment. So you climbed up to the second story, and that's where we had radio and television and more modern communication, and you scratch the surface of modern communication in 1980, and what do you find? On the West Coast, things called microcomputers are being born, or have been born, but they certainly have not reached the East Coast, because when I described to the board some of the things we were going to do in this history of human communication exhibit, and I mentioned computers, there were a couple of cynics on the board who, you can't do that with children. Computers are only these great big devices that are in, It was a very interesting period, a unique moment, if you will, Kay, in the history of computers, because on the West Coast, pets and apples meant microcomputers. Today, we all know what an apple means. On the East Coast, a pet was a dog or a cat, and an apple was a piece of fruit. Mm-hmm. So the West Coast was way ahead of us, or ahead of most of us, on the East Coast. But it was very clear as we were doing the research, and I had an incredible young man. You may know of him. If you don't, he'd be a wonderful person to interview about the Atari, Peter Hirschberg, who I often say of Peter, he had silicon running through his veins because he really understood, and his subsequent career after he left the Children's Museum certainly... Do you know the name? Are you familiar?
I know the name. I know he was the manager of your computer center, and
yes.
I was going to ask you if I should talk to him.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely get hold of Peter. Tell him I said to call, because he was the key. You know, you have curators who have expertise in different areas, different subject matter areas, and Peter was the curator of the computers. I mean, he led us. He had very deep knowledge of what was going on, and he led us to really key places and key people, so that we ended up at the request of Al Gore, whose wife Tipper Gore was a board member of the museum. At Al Gore's, but Al was actually just right on top of what we were doing. It's a shame that he took so much jabbing in the media for having, quote unquote, invented the internet, but he was present at the beginning. You know, he was head of something called the Congressional Clearinghouse for the Future, and he knew what the government agencies were doing in terms of things that were going to have a profound impact on the future. Certainly in the area then called telecommunications. So Al called us over. And Peter and I think maybe one or two others from the museum, went over to Al's office on the Hill, sat on the floor with Al around a low circular glass coffee table, and among the five of us, we kind of stumbled through what it was that Al was asking for, and basically he wanted us to give a course for members of Congress in how to use microcomputers. So that we said, sure. You know, what did we know?
Sure.
We said, sure, we'll... Yeah, right.
Al Gore asked you to do that? You go, okay, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And he participated very closely. Anyway, we were at the time that this meeting with Al occurred, I'm sure we had already made our first trip to Silicon Valley, where there were several trips to Silicon Valley. One of them we were at PARC, P-A-R-C, Xerox PARC.
Yeah.
Are you familiar with
Palo Alto
Xerox PARC?
Research Center? Sure.
Yes, right. Okay. So we hung out there with Alan Kay, who was creating what turned out to be Windows. That's really interesting because usually when you go into a research center, you sign a disclosure that says that anything that you bring in, they can use. I'm sorry, I have it backwards. You can't take anything out that you've seen, okay? And they don't mean tangible things. They mean ideas or concepts or conversations or anything. Xerox PARC was just the opposite. Anything that you brought in, they could keep and work with. So we were in Alan Kay's lab. We saw a prototype of what today we know as Windows. I think Peter had an inkling, probably a very strong inkling of what he was looking at. I didn't have an inkling of what I was looking at, but I had total trust in Peter and certainly trusted PARC. But when Bill Gates came through Alan Kay's lab, he knew just what he was looking at, and the rest is history with Bill Gates. But it was, we had the privilege, and I attribute a lot of this to Peter because he knew where to go. He knew where the future was, if you will. I remember who we had with us. Wait a second, his name will come to me in a minute. He wrote something called Xanadu Hypertext. Ted Nelson.
Sure.
Does that name mean anything? Okay. Yes. So Ted, it was the team that went into Xerox PARC was Ted Nelson, Peter Hirschberg, and myself. That was our traveling idea team.
Wow.
And Ted was incredible. I mean, his book. Do you have his book Xanadu Hypertext?
No, I have his book Computer Lib Dream Machines.
I think that's well. This is what I'm thinking of as a great big oversized paperback that that has computer lib on one side and Dream Machines on the other side. So you read it halfway through.
You flip it over. Yeah, that's the one. Mm-hmm.
Exactly. That's the one. Okay. Anyway, it's a classic. And he was a classic. He was a character. But that was that early design team. So Park, of course, was one of the places we visited. And then we visited the, what would be the future. And one of those places, of course, was Atari. And another was Apple. I remember visiting Apple. I dressed in my most proper Eastern attire, which meant hose and heels and a dignified suit, and sat waiting to meet with Steve Jobs. And this young kid runs in a dungarees and a black T-shirt and a ponytail, and that was Steve Jobs. And really fast, it was clear that this man was on the move and wasn't going to give me very much time. So in 2 words, way less than what I'm telling you here today, I made it clear to him that we wanted microcomputers, and we were going to do something with the Hill. And you say you're on Capitol Hill, which we were. We were 8 blocks from the Capitol. You say Capitol Hill when you're on, when you're any place but in Washington D.C. And for a lot of people, particularly in that era, it's like, whoa, can we get access to this museum? So we blah blah blah. You can understand the rest. So Atari and Apple both jumped at the opportunity to put computers into the museum. Atari started off with a gift of 50 Atari microcomputers, as they were called, and ultimately Apple gave us over 100, plus a lot of tech support, plus somebody who linked the computers for one of the schools that we were running at that time. So we had a lot of support from Silicon Valley.
Wow.
And it was a unique moment in the history of computers. I'm not sure we recognize unique moments when we're in the middle of them. I think we only recognize them looking back at them, perhaps. But it was a unique moment, and it was a wonderful experience.
Wow. So we're still at Apple for a minute. You hit up Steve Jobs for a bunch of computers, and was it just like, sure, no problem? Yes,
it was essentially, yeah. He said, yes, here, get in touch with, and he gave me the name of the woman, Barbara, I'll think of her last name, but not at the moment, who was in charge of their giveaway program. And, the computers came very quickly. Actually, I think we worked with Atari first. I think it may have been a second trip to Silicon Valley when I met, when I went to Apple and met Steve Jobs, because I think we had Future Center well up and running when Apple joined us as a partner, if you will. So I think Atari definitely came first.
Do you remember who you met there and how that experience was?
Atari was flying high. I mean, Atari was going to run the world because anybody who understood computers loved the Atari because of all of the incredible graphic things that it could do. It was, you really, at that point, you didn't know who would ultimately emerge as the leaders of the market, and Atari certainly wanted to do that. And I think I could have the name wrong. Peter may remember. I think it was a woman named Linda Gordon, but I could be wrong about that. And she was, I'm not even sure what her title was, whether it was marketing or, VP for something. But she actually wanted to, quote unquote, buy the Children's Museum. By this time I had hired, wait a minute, that was at Atari. I had hired some programmers and super bright, totally alternative, but super bright. And they took that Atari and they turned it inside out. So they made it do everything it could possibly do. And then when we went out and showed it to Atari, they called a meeting of, I don't know who, but they had a lot of people at that meeting clearly people who were designing their computers, and when they saw what this children's museum in Washington, D.C. had done with their machine, they were just bowled over, because these really smart young men, and they were all men, these really smart young men who we had hired, and in retrospect, I'm sure Peter had a lot to do with the hiring of that team. They had made some wonderful things happen. I mean, pretty much anything you could do graphically with an Atari at that point, with that, I don't even remember if it was strictly 8-bit or if it was 8-bit 16. Or
it was only 8 at that point, yeah.
Yeah, okay. Well, anything you could do with an 8-bit machine, an 8-bit Atari, they made it do. So when we showed them examples of the software that this team had created, they wanted it. They wanted in. And I guess they wanted us to be a software developer for them. And I actually think, and again, check Peter's memory on this also, Kay, but I actually think it got to the point where they sent a draft of a contract between what would have been the Children's Museum and Atari Computer, so that they could basically buy, if you will, or own, if you will, our group of programmers. It did not come to fruition. Whether that's good or bad, I don't know. Peter might have some interesting ideas on that. But that did not come to fruition, but that team did some wonderful, wonderful work that meant when you came in to use the computer, we sprinkled the Ataris through pretty much throughout the exhibits. Not only with a whole bank of the computers in the part of the exhibit on human communication that spoke to current technology, but we also took computers that related to other things. For example, we had a small exhibit that we called Metricville, where we were trying to introduce the metric system. And you have to understand, in the Children's Museum that we had there in Washington, everything was hands-on. So if we're dealing in metrics, we had shoes to try on in metrics, and a grocery store to weigh items in metrics, and a scale with some weighted suitcases of different weights to put up on a metric scale, and a lumber shop where the wood was measured in metrics. So it was, everything was hands-on. So our great programming team designed a program in metrics for children to use, to try to get some idea of metrics. I don't remember the detail of that piece of software anymore. Peter might remember the detail, but it's just an example of the fact that we took the Ataris and sprinkled them wherever you could enhance something in an exhibit by adding an interesting piece of software to it.
How neat!
Yeah, it was neat.
Cool. Yeah. And some of the, so it seems to me, based on my reading, that there was a lot of little programs like you talked about, like the metric stuff, and there was a program to teach counting in binary, and there was a program where the computer would talk to you, and that was all created by your little in-house group. And then some of the software, at least one piece, was good enough to be picked up by a publisher, and there was a painting program called Paint.
Right.
Which was published by Reston and then later published by Atari.
Yep, I still have that. I have that on my we were very excited about that. I had a wonderful, wonderful educator on the staff by the name of Alex Packer. I'd worked with him earlier in one of the schools that I had founded. I'm just looking. Yeah, there it is. There's Paint. Yes, so it's right there. And Alex wrote the text for that. But it was very exciting.
Oh,
and it was wonderful.
Alex wrote that manual. So good. It's so good and funny and well written.
He's terrific.
Yeah.
Alex. He was a brilliant educator. I think he got his master's in education. I'm not sure it's a program that's still offered at Harvard. And I hired him. I interviewed him, and I said, boy, we need him. We need you. And I hired him, I think, right out of Harvard. But yeah, I'm so glad to hear you have a copy of that. Superboots. That was the name of our little group.
Right,
Superboots.
the software development lab. Now, I'm still trying to. I've been thinking about this for months, but it's like having a museum that had a software development lab within it is so strange and good.
Yes. Well, it was, as I said, it was a unique moment in the history of computers. One that will never return again, because nothing had been created yet. Everything that we were doing, you were doing for the first time. But as an educator, the potential in these machines was, well, actually, my interest goes back before. There was a professor at, I believe it was University of it was University of Pittsburgh. It wasn't Carnegie Mellon, by the name of O.K. Moore. Is that a little bit of history you know?
I don't know that, no.
Okay, it's O period K period, standing for Omar Khayyam Moore, Moore, and he had created what I think he referred to as a talking typewriter, where children could teach themselves to read and write. And again, it was way ahead of its time, and his idea was actually stolen by somebody whose name I don't recall at the moment, who literally stole his idea and later met O.K. Moore at a conference, and the blood drained from his face because he looked at him and said, "I didn't know you were still alive," because he literally had lifted everything that Moore had done and attempted to make a commercial product. And Peter may or may not remember. I don't know if Peter was part of this, but I actually visited O.K. Moore in Pittsburgh. So this was earlier. This was still in my quest to try to see what we could do to help children more easily learn to read and write. And really, it's only with today's brain research that we're beginning to get answers to things like that. Mm-hmm. But they still haven't made it into education, unfortunately. In a few places they have, but not in most places. Anyway, so my interest went way back because I was always looking for answers to how can we help children learn more facilely, particularly if they're children who are struggling to learn to read and write, which are such vitally important things to do in our culture. So I was familiar with the work of O.K. Moore and what they were calling learning machines at the time, and also this other gentleman who basically had stolen his work. Maybe I've blocked his name intentionally because
Yeah, no, I'm aware of a book called the Talking Typewriter Cookbook.
Yes.
And which is not by O.K. Moore. I don't know that
book.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
I was wondering if that was the book that you're thinking of that borrowed some of the ideas.
I don't know that book. So whether it was or not, I don't know. But it could well have been. It could well have been. But Moore again he was a visionary, way ahead of his time, and he really was a researcher on learning, which was also ahead of his time because the whole field of cognitive science didn't really get off. I mean, there were people, long ago who recognized that there was something more to this business called learning, but it was really only at the beginning of the 60s that cognitive science began to come into its own. There's a wonderful book by Howard Gardner. Are you familiar with Gardner's work?
No, I don't think so.
Gardner has been at Harvard his whole life, went to school there and never left. And he in 19, I believe it was, I don't remember if it was 82 or 83, he wrote his book Frames of Mind, which talked about multiple intelligences. And he was funded, and he literally traveled the world to look at what cultures around the world all thought of as intelligence, and came up with a list of 7, which he later expanded to 8 or 9 intelligences. But it's quite an incredible book. And one of his books is that I think an earlier book, I'm pulling it off the shelf right now, that Howard wrote is called The Mind's New Science, the subtitle is History of the Cognitive Revolution. And let me see when that book was published. That was published in 1987. Okay, so it was it's a wonderful book. If you want to trace these things back, almost anything Gardner writes is wonderful. The Mind's New Science would put the history of the birth of cognitive science there, but that it was early on. That's a relatively new science. But there have always been people striving to try to figure out what the mind is all about, and my interest was always from the perspective of how can we help children learn more readily.
Mm-hmm. Is there any chance that any of the software still exists that was created specifically for the museum?
I don't have any, and I don't know what you'd play it on today.
Oh, don't worry about that. I got that.
Don't worry about it. You have that. Oh, fabulous. That's great. If it exists, I certainly don't have it, and I'm sorry because I've been a saver of things. I certainly tend to save books and papers. Let me just see if my version. Yeah, wait a minute. I do have a copy tucked in my book of the Paint. It says Paint CCM, copyright 1982. Mm-hmm. Do you not have that?
No. Paint is fine. Paint has been saved and scanned and digitized. It was the little museum programs that
all the other ones.
Yeah.
I do not have those. Talk to Peter and see if by any chance he has those. And I'm just trying to think whether there's anybody else. I don't know if Peter has stayed in touch. I have not stayed in touch with that wonderful early team. And I'm embarrassed to tell you that I don't remember their names. One of them I think was Kevin. I think another was David. See if Peter has kept in touch with and can put you in touch with them.
Sure. Okay.
And see if he was smart enough. I wasn't smart enough to recognize that we might have been doing something of historic value. But see if Peter was smart enough, because he's way smarter. He can run circles around me in technology, to put it mildly. He really saw the future. Peter had great vision. I was so fortunate to have found him, to hire him at that particular time in the museum's development. And I remember when he told me he was going to leave, I burst into tears. I said, Peter, how can I do this without you? But he wanted to go back to grad school, and he did. He went to Penn and got his MBA, and then went on to great things in the field of computing. Actually, I think he was called in by people like Bill Gates to train their upper management and to, put some history. Peter's a wonderful presenter. So you definitely must be in touch with him.
I will do my best. And by the way, Linda Gordon was her name. You nailed that. Good memory.
Okay. Thank you. Is she still around somewhere?
I don't know. She's next on my list after Peter.
We'll see. Oh, boy. You know what? I'd love to hear her perspective and her memory on the interchange. She may have a much clearer and more detailed memory than I do of that early interchange between the museum and Atari.
So what do you think was the most popular use of the computers, the Ataris and the Apples, that when the kids were banging around doing things? What was the go-to? What did they want to play with most?
Oh, any of those things we had out on the floor. I guess the Centimeter Eater. I mean, if I had to say one, probably Centimeter Eater, because it was so active and there was noise. There was not only generated movement, but you generated noise and color, and it was almost Pac-Man-esque in the way that Centimeter Eater traveled along in a line, chomping down whatever Centimeter Eater was chomping on. So certainly that, but you know about the computer classroom, yes?
Well, yes, I'd like to know more about it. I understand
Sure.
there was this lab, and tell me all about it.
Okay, so we named it Future Center, a very ambitious name, and I had a wonderful architect. It actually may have been the architect through whom I met Peter. He may have sent him over to see me one day and just said, Ann, meet this person, or may have told Peter, meet Ann, or whatever. Pull Peter's memory on that, too, whether it was through Roy Mason. But Roy was a futurist, really brilliant. He was a founding member of the World Future Society with some of the other notaries who were part of that movement. Barbara Hubbard was one of them, and there was a really well-known man whose name will come to me. But anyway, they were there in Washington, and I'm trying to think of what my first contact was with Roy. Roy worked so closely with us. He did a lot of designs. Roy was one of those people who was so fast with the pen. He could sketch it while you were stumbling to articulate an idea. Roy would be sketching it, and you'd look at his sketch 3 minutes later, and you'd say, "Oh yes, that's exactly what I want to do." He was very, very gifted, and his own background is really interesting because Roy could barely read or write. He'd gone to Texas Tech, and then he went to the Yale School of Architecture. And I said, Peter, how did you get, not Peter, Roy, how did you get through school? And he said, I would design the costumes, or I would design the sets for the play, or, just super bright, but, some minds just don't master reading and writing, and Roy was an example of one of those. Mm-hmm. So we would trade services. I would go to, late in the middle of the night, I'd go to his house and type all his business letters for him, and then he would do our designs for the Children's Museum. So that way, we never had much of a budget at the Children's Museum, so anything that I could get done pro bono, I would get done pro bono. So Roy was really one of our best friends. I could call Roy at 2 o'clock in the morning and say, Roy, and I knew that he'd be awake. He was, we were both always awake. And I'd call him and say, Roy, the southeast end of the building on the third floor, that room, I need a sketch of that room because I've got a proposal going to the National Science Foundation tomorrow, and I need a picture of kids doing whatever it was I needed to have the kids doing, and he'd have the picture on my desk at 10 a.m. in the morning. So he was that kind of quick. So, of course, when we were designing something called Future Center, I called Roy in, and he came up with the idea of of encircling the room that we had chosen with like a sawtooth-shaped desk, and we did it in a really high-quality wood and well-finished and all, and make that the location so that you both had some privacy but also could see other screens if you wanted to in the room. And I'm guessing that the room held maybe 30, maybe 35. There are some of the articles that I dug out about Future Center may have this. In fact, the best of the articles, I dug out 4 articles because you'd asked about that, Kay. And actually, Peter's article is the best of the ones that I dug out. Some of them weren't as accurate, mm-hmm. but they have some information on Future Center. But the door to the room we covered in some kind of shiny reflective material, silvery, shiny, reflective, and, in big, bold, futuristic kinds of letters, which I'm sure Roy also designed. We wrote the words Future Center. So right away, before you entered, you had the sense, that there was going to be something magical or special in that room. And we actually opened Future Center a couple of years, maybe 18 months to 2 years before we opened the History of Human Communication exhibit. So it was the first of the many, many, many galleries in that vast exhibit that we opened. So we started running Future Center sometime in 1981. And again, we were really fortunate to hire an incredible group of young people to be instructors. We had young people who both had the curiosity and the ingenuity themselves to learn to manipulate the 8-bit machines. But they also were wonderful teachers. So we had many, many programs. I mean, Future Center was booked to the gills literally from the day it opened. There was that much interest in what are these things called microcomputers. And we did a course called Compu-Tots where a parent could come with a child. We did courses for school children and their teachers of all ages. We did courses for adults on things that might have been of more interest to adults. We had birthday parties. We were fully booked. I mean, 7 days a week. From the moment we opened, until we closed, Future Center was booked. I think some people even booked it. They paid the museum a special fee, and I think we even let special parties book it in the evenings. Just to bring in some extra revenue for the museum. But this you'll get a kick out of this part of the story. Suddenly, in 1983, the business dropped off for Future Center.
Mm-hmm.
We still had groups come in, but nothing like that constant rush, constant booking of those first 2 years.
What changed?
And what changed? People bought computers.
Mm-hmm.
People bought their own. That's an indication of how quickly that market developed. There was really like a 2 to 2.5 year period, and then people started to buy computers. And of course, they were probably 8/16-bit. I don't even know. I don't remember the date when the true 16-bit microcomputer came out. But the rest is history. The machines. When I think of what I work on now and what I and what I worked on then, it's you're living. Obviously, you're deeply immersed in the history of it. But the change was spectacular. But even before computers were anything like what we know as the computer today, people began to buy them. At least, the leading edge of the market began at that point. I'm trying to remember what brand we had at that point. I can remember this big clunky thing sitting on my desk. It was a unique moment in history, that period in the 70s and into the early 80s that saw the birth of this incredible thing that today, homes, we've got at least 3 of them in our own home.
Sure.
Right.
And if you count the iPads and the phones and the dishwasher, and you've got 100.
Right. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Absolutely. my Cuisinart is on its last legs. I refuse to buy a new one because I don't want to have to deal with one more computer.
Sure. How well did these computers hold up being abused, 15 hours a day by kids and adults? Did they need to be replaced, or did you ever repair them? What happened there?
That's a good question. I seem to remember that they held up amazingly well. I don't remember that we had a warehouse, if you will, or storeroom, if you will, with a lot of broken computers. I think they held up very well. Nice.
All right. So tell me about. I'm fascinated with the members of Congress coming in to learn about computers.
Yes.
What can you tell me about that day?
We actually, Al Gore. There's a room. There was a room between the House and the Senate. EF 100. The name of the room sticks in my mind. And it's a nice classroom-sized room, and I don't know what I don't know what the members use it for, but whatever they want to use it for. And Al reserved that room. He had us set up our course for congressmen in room EF 100 between the 2 buildings, and he sent a memo out. A dear colleague memo. I don't know. I just don't know how many of the papers I saved, and I bet I didn't. I bet I didn't save that paper, but someplace in the files, there would have been obviously. Maybe Peter has a copy of Al Gore's memo to his colleagues saying on X dates, come I'm paraphrasing because I don't have the copy in my head or in front of me, but it would have been something like, please come join us. Capitol Children's Museum will be members of the staff of the Capitol Children's Museum will be teaching us how to use microcomputers, because the members of the Congress and the Senate certainly didn't know how to use microcomputers. Nobody did at that point. And because Atari was so excited, they sent people from the West Coast. I remember the Kahn brothers. Do you know Ted and Bob Kahn?
Sure, yeah. I've interviewed both of them. Okay.
Well, I think they may have come under the aegis of Atari to help teach that course. Ask them, if you talk with them again, ask them, did they come and help as instructors in that course? Or it may just have been, I don't remember who all the wonderful people were who came in and worked on that course with us. I remember I taught Excel, if you can believe that. So Peter taught something, I taught Excel, and then we had, I think that the people who were not, this is just to the best of my recollection, Peter may have different, Peter may add more texture or actually have a different memory than I do, but my memory is that, people like Peter and I, and, there may have been a couple of other members of the Children's Museum staff who were the actual instructors, and then I think the people who circulated to give as much one-on-one instruction as necessary to the members of Congress could well have been from Atari, or it could have been people like Ted and Bob, who came and actually did that instruction. And I don't know what the follow-on was in terms of whether people on the Hill, individual members of Congress actually purchased machines. I didn't follow. I should have in retrospect, but I didn't follow through to say, well, what did they learn and how many did. I don't know whose memory you could pull on some. Maybe you could do an interview with Al Gore.
Sure, I'm sure he's thrilled. Will be thrilled to talk about Atari computers with me.
You never know. It might touch a responsive chord.
I don't know how long you remained at the museum. Can you guess what ultimately happened to all those Ataris and Apples as they became obsolete?
Oh, let me see. I left because my sweet, wonderful second husband proposed marriage to me, and he lived in Tennessee, and so I left in February of 1995. By that time, we had 2 computers in the Early Childhood Center. I have no recollection of what brand they were. We opened that in 1989, and the junior high school we opened in 1990, and we had networked computers, and at that time we had Ford Foundation money supporting that school because Ford had invested a huge amount of money in one of the first networked CAI programs, computer-assisted instruction, with a man by the name of Bob Taggart, who had been head of something or other in the Labor Department, and then, had a vision that it would help people learn better if they could learn on computers. So he did a CAI program, and Ford actually gave us, I think, about $500,000 to work with Taggart and set up a lab so that our 100 students in the junior high school could use network computers. And it was supposed to be individually responsive, a program that whatever level you began at, the software would match you and bring you forward gradually according to your own ability. It turned out that, and that was where Apple helped us enormously, because they came in and gave us as many computers as we needed for that school. And I think Roy, again, came in and designed the rooms, the computer, we had a series of I don't know, maybe 8, 9, 10 rooms, little small rooms. They were small rooms, and so Bob Taggart himself and some of his tech people came in and helped set that up. But Apple actually gave us technical support to network all those computers. Apple gave us about 100 computers in all, which we had sprinkled everywhere in our offices and in the schools. And I don't remember if we. Again, Peter might remember, or he might have been gone by that time. I don't remember if Future Center remained with the Ataris or if we ultimately replaced them. That's beyond my recollection. And I'm trying to think of after Peter left, I'm not even sure I recall. Well, the name of the person who was my museum manager was Greg Gauthier, Gauthier. He's actually, Greg was another one of those unbelievable, incredible, one-of-a-kind staff members, an incredible manager.
There was something called the KidNet computerized message system. What do you remember about that? Never worked. never brought it to fruition.
It was really an example of having been gifted with a dinosaur. The history of DEC Computer,
sure,
right?
A little bit,
yeah. And I'm sure you've read Soul of a New Machine, Tracy Kidder's book.
Sure.
Yep. So, in the process of all of this, I became really very close personal friends with Gwen and Gordon Bell. Does that name mean anything to you?
Sure.
Gordon Bell.
Absolutely.
Okay. Well, Gordon and Gwen became very, very close friends, and they were determined to get a deck into the Children's Museum. So they got a machine. They gifted us with a machine and set it up, but did not network or program it. That we had to raise the money to do that, and I never could raise the money. I tried hard. I had, what was the name of that company involved? Something Atlantic. I don't remember right now. But no, we never got it off the ground. I never could get it programmed, so it was an idea that never came to fruition. It was a wonderful idea. It too would have been way ahead of its time for that era, but couldn't make it happen.
Sure.
And it was a great embarrassment. It was, really, it was one of the only things that I look back on that Children's Museum period and say that was an abject failure because we couldn't get it done.
So what was the biggest success then, as far as the tech stuff went? I mean, what are you just super proud of?
Well, certainly. That young team that I had, the book that Alex Packer wrote, Future Center, just the having as much good technology, and when I say good, I mean things where, and there's one other piece of it that I'll have to tell you too, having as much technology that really put children in charge of their own learning. That to me was always the critical thing, is the child driving the experience with a good tool, meaning a good computer as an adjunct for the child to approach with his or her own interests and wherewithal, and to approach in different ways. And that was one of the wonderful things about what we were doing in Future Center. If your media was activity, there were things that could make that computer be very active. If it was sound, if it was graphics, whatever you were good at, you could bring your skill to the experience that you were having. So that, to me, was I still don't see enough of that kind of thing happening when I visit schools or look at the typical classroom. So that was definitely successful, and also the energy and the synergy of the incredible young people who really made it all happen, who worked for us. At any level in that museum, whether it was one of my top managers like Peter and Greg, or whether it was the volunteers on the floor, or they were all it was their enthusiasm and dedication to the work that they were doing. We had, the museum grew to the point of having about 100 staff. So we had, I had a lot of I had maybe 7 department managers and then specialists like Peter, for example, who had who had ownership of very particular things. I had another very, very brilliant young man in computer animation, and we ran an animation program where we would send notice out to schools throughout the Metro D.C. area and say, teachers, and here we were looking particularly at, maybe kids in 6th through 8th or 9th grade, and we would say, teachers, do you have, words to this effect, do you have students at the back of your classroom who are always fidgety and never paying attention and, disruptive? Send us those kids. So we gave them lessons in computer animation, and they were brilliant. And, talk about notable people. Chuck Jones, the cartoonist,
Sure.
Dropped by and saw what we were doing and fell in love with it, and he would come and give a master class at least once a year.
Holy cow.
To our, yeah. So we had, in fact, you'll appreciate this story. So, we were always trying to raise money, and we were having a big, trying to remember what the opening was, whether we were opening, we were opening a major exhibition in the space that formerly had been the History of Human Communication exhibit, and it was the life and work of Chuck Jones. Nothing small. I mean, a massive exhibit. He actually brought things out of his own personal collection that we hung in the entry hallway. The first drawing he ever did, we had that in the exhibit, but the rest of it was in as very much hands-on. So it was in conjunction with that exhibit that he would come and do the master classes. So we were having a big opening of the exhibit, and somebody on staff had the intelligence, it wasn't my idea, but I wish I remembered who, to send somebody from the exhibit construction department to Home Depot or whatever store was available and say, bring me 10 hollow core doors. So for about $20 a door, the person came back with 10 doors, and Chuck Jones, in, like a minute and a half, scribbled a cartoon on each one of those doors, and we put them up for auction, and they brought $10,000 a door.
Wow. Brilliant.
to the museum, and it wasn't my idea. Some brilliant person on staff had that insight. But so the work with him was just extraordinary. I mean, and to sit and watch Chuck Jones do a master class with these, with students who were sent to us because the teachers considered them incorrigible and they couldn't learn and whatnot. Chuck Jones unleashed the genius in those kids, and he intuitively understood. His book is wonderful. Do you know? Let me see. What's the name of his book?
No, I don't know his book.
Okay, I'll send you a copy of it because there's a whole philosophy of education embedded. I'll send you a copy. I'll send you his book title. So that was definitely a highlight. Another highlight were some of the ancillary things that were happening on that second floor of the History of Communications exhibit. For example, a company called, was it Pacific Labs, donated equipment for what was then state-of-the-art radio production. And we had a young high school dropout by the name of Derek Gibbs Johnson, who at the age of 15 took over that radio studio and had kids, and this was all inner-city oriented. He had kids from the inner city, young kids, broadcasting radio programs. Well, we didn't broadcast from the museum, but they would record, and then the pieces would later be broadcast. So that was an absolute highlight of the experience. Derek died, and unfortunately, an untimely death. He was very young when he died. We were all shocked because again, he was irreplaceable. just irreplaceable. And he kind of grew up in that museum. We had a photography lab as part of that exhibit, and another youngster from D.C. Public Schools, inner city, who was a gifted photographer, and he taught the photography course using whatever we had again in that upper part of the exhibit. He taught the photography in the junior high school, and he too died an untimely death. Nestor Hernandez died very young, which was very sad. The thing that never really got off the ground was the video studio. We had, I can't remember now how state-of-the-art the video was, but that never gelled. We had an exhibit that's pretty typical. I'm walking through those halls as I recollect this. We had one that's pretty. We had a little exhibit that we called strobe theater, where a strobe light went off against one of those reflective backgrounds that will capture your image for several seconds before it fades. That was very popular. I know what we have now. We had an animation studio on that upper level, and it was a beautiful studio. It was banked with windows, so there was a lot of natural light, and we painted it in some very soft colors. The ceiling, because kids, when you're daydreaming, you'll often look up at a ceiling while you're thinking about something. So we had someone paint amorphous clouds that vaguely represented the shape of Chuck Jones cartoons, so that we didn't really paint. But, that was what the ceiling was like. And then we had, I'm sure you've seen drawings where you begin with one thing and it morphs to something entirely different.
Sure.
And I'm trying to remember the name of the person. We met an awful lot of people over the years, Kay, and this was somebody who turned a mouse into an elephant. It was a static panel. There was no movement in it, but he did a series of cell drawings. It was like full wall size. It was nothing tiny. It was a great big piece on the wall, morphing into an elephant. Oh, Peter might remember his name, because that computer animation lab was very successful in terms of we didn't book it the way we charged a nominal fee, like $2 per course or something like that. I think that's in one of the articles I'll send to you. We charged a nominal fee in Future Center, but we didn't charge anything for the animation lab on that second floor, that high-tech floor of the communications exhibit. But and I think that the animation studio we maintained when we changed from the history of human communication to the life and work of Chuck Jones, when we changed that exhibit. So that was another area that was loaded with sit down yourself and work at your work out what you want to work out in computer animation. And again, we would have these really wonderful young volunteers who would be available. We had an incredible volunteer department. I think we had something like 250 volunteers who our volunteer manager organized. Just Susan Albers was her name. We had some extraordinary staff there, and Susan ran this big volunteer program. So that was always staffed, and that was very successful.
Wow!
But it was we were thronged with visitors. Visitors loved the experience. I sort of, in time turned over because I had such good managers. There was the kind of thing where I didn't need to manage them. They knew what they were doing far better than I knew. And that was a great arrival, and that freed my time so that I really went on to start the two schools that we ran there. The junior high school that I mentioned and the early childhood center.
Very good.
So that's and after I left and moved some years, maybe I don't remember how many years, the museum, from what I gather, kind of went into a decline. I took my grandson there once, and everything seemed unpainted and shabby and, a little bit, to put it mildly, a little bit run down. And the trustees, so we had gotten the grant from HUD was, I'm trying to remember now, $2 million or $3 million to buy the 3 acres and 150,000 square feet of buildings. And the trustees sold the whole thing to a developer for $27 million. And it took them, it took them forever to get up and running again. So there is something running called a Children's Museum in Washington. I'll never visit it.
So
never.
Oh. So the National Children's Museum is what it's called now. So is it the same thing, or is it a different entity?
Oh, some of the same people are still on the board,
yeah.
So I have no idea how they've handled the corporate aspects of it. Absolutely no idea. And I'm very far away from D.C. and
sure.
When I'm there, I have other things that I want to do. You can't go back. You can't go back. You do something and you put you put all of yourself into it when you do it. But then once you leave, you don't go back.
Sure. Yeah.
There was one other interesting thing that we did where we also had computers in it. We did a groundbreaking exhibit on the Holocaust called Remember the Children, where we told the story of the Holocaust without the brutality. We didn't have, images of heaps of corpses or anything like that would really assault a child's sense of their own security. But it was a gripping exhibit that ultimately was and we had some computers in that exhibit. I'm just trying to think how interactive they were. I'm not sure that they were interactive computers. I think they were computers that just sat there and did things that you could look at. But ultimately, that exhibit was adapted as the permanent children's offering at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, on the mall in D.C.
Wow.
They changed its name. We called it Remember the Children. They call it Daniel's Story, but I've never wanted to go see it. And just a little personal note here. My historian, curator, partner, brilliant man. We worked hand in hand along with some of the museum staff to create that exhibit. He was one of the first COVID deaths.
I'm sorry.
This past year.
Mm-hmm.
Brilliant mind. But, those are, looking back over the 20 years, those are some of the highlights that stand out. Certainly the early years in computers were, no question about that.
So what haven't I asked you about that time that I should have?
Well, the leitmotif, if you will, of my life always during those years was trying to keep the money raised. That was really, really difficult. At that time, Washington didn't have much corporate presence. It was kind of after I moved away, some corporate presence began to grow in the Washington suburbs particularly. But at the time that I was running it, raising money was always the bête noire. It was... It always occupied 100% of my time and attention, and everything else occupied the other 100% of my time and attention. But no matter how difficult the exigencies of the daily grind of raising the money might have been on any given day, it was like a roller coaster. I could be down at the bottom, and then something that would happen with the museum would shoot way up to the top because it would be wonderful. We'd get we had wonderful press reviews. I wish I'd kept more of them over the years. But I guess what I think the one thing that I regret deeply looking back is that I didn't have the time to be more of a mentor to the incredible young people who worked with the museum. It's that I think that's one thing I really regret, because the museum couldn't have existed without our volunteer corps and without those incredible staff members at all levels and all departments. And I regret that I didn't have more time as an individual to share with them, more about who they were and who I was. The days, the days weren't long enough, nor were the nights. It was, what do I often say to my husband? It was 40 years packed into 20. So,
sounds like an amazing time.
It was. It really was. It really was. But that's my one regret looking back. But there were many. Here's another little story. So Michael Jackson came to visit the museum at one point, and nobody was supposed to know because his handlers didn't want a mob there. But of course, word got out. I mean, the Washington Post published his schedule, so of course the Children's Museum was on his schedule, and I gave him the tour. And so I linked arms, and he was very tall, and I'm short. So we went through the museum, and what he said to me again and again was, "Where are the children?" He wanted to be with the children, and then he also said again and again, "I don't want to talk to anybody." But at one point, he needed to use a bathroom, so I took him into the nearest facility, and we happened to be near the part of the building that the options school, the junior high school, occupied. So we walk into a classroom, and several of the students look up, and they say, "There's Michael Jackson." And then other students said, "No, that's not Michael Jackson." They just couldn't believe it. And when two stories about him, so that's one. When he asked for the shoe size of every child and sent 100 pairs of athletic shoes for every child in that school, which was very touching. And then he said to me, "I want to see the children." So I took him upstairs to see our preschool, and they were all excited because they knew who Michael Jackson was. So we sat down on the floor with the children as they proceeded to sing not one or two, but all 5 stanzas of the song, "The Wheels on the Bus Go Round and Round." And his handlers were crazy to get him out of there. "Come on," they kept tugging at him, and he would not budge. He wanted to stay and hear all the singing that the children wanted to do for him. So, stories like that. I don't know that I'll ever write. I've had 6 books published about the work I've done in early education, but I don't know that I'll ever write the book about the Children's Museum. It would take probably longer than my lifetime will be to do that piece of writing. Because as I said, I'm very tied up in this science text right now. I'm very excited about it, and then I have to do the option school book, particularly with everything that's going on in the schools right now. So that's maybe more than you ever wanted to hear, Kay.
No, that was exactly what I wanted to hear. So normally I ask, what do you do these days? But it sounds like you're doing a lot of writing.
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, yes. Head over heels. I'm very excited about this book. The title isn't too ambitious. It's called Saving Planet Earth. That's the main title. And then the colon, after the colon, the title is Revolutionary Ways to Teach Eco-Education to Young Children. And by young, I'm talking about ages 0 to 8. And I'm self-publishing for a whole bunch of reasons. I had and withdrew from one publishing contract and turned down a second offer and just decided that to get the book I wanted, I would have to self-publish it. And it looks as if it's going to be upwards of 450 pages with over 320, 330 images in it, and I'm going to do it in full color. So it's hopefully parts of it are being typeset as we speak, thank goodness, and hopefully at some time in the near future I can clear my desk and my files and move on to another thing. But it's been all absorbing, and I've had some amazing experiences in terms of some of the work that's going on at the forefront of evolutionary science and genomics today is unbelievable. It's mind-boggling. I'll give you one tiny piece that there's a scientist at, I don't know how to pronounce it, GUELF University in, I believe it's Ontario or near Ontario, who's raised the money for a project that is gathering up, is assembling, and a lot has been assembled, but they're trying to assemble information on every living species and barcode every species, so that the way the restaurant person will come around and, give you your check, or, the grocery store barcode unit that reads the UPC,
Mm-hmm.
so that you can point this little pocket device at an animal and instantly find out everything that anybody knows about that species, plant or animal. So that's one of the forefront things that's going on by this brilliant professor, Paul Hebert, Hebert, at the University of Guelph, who's raised millions and millions of dollars for the entity within that university that is doing this work. And then he partnered, and I found this out almost by accident, with somebody I had written about in Costa Rica, who's a MacArthur Fellow, who had literally saved an ecosystem. We all know about tropical wet forests, but there's also a tropical dry forest, and they were practically extinct. And Daniel Jansen has been living half-time in Costa Rica for decades now and rescued a tropical dry forest. So he's also involved in the barcoding. He's working with Paul Hebert, but he is training people who are indigenous Costa Ricans to do the work of both collecting the information and ultimately working on the barcoding itself. So, there's some, it's been, I just feel so fortunate, I don't know what other word to use, to have discovered, because a lot of the things I have in the book I tripped across. I didn't set out to learn that, but I found it and I said, wow, this story has to be told. So I just feel very fortunate to have tripped across some of these people doing such incredible work, and met some of them not personally, but through email exchanges back and forth, just to be sure that that I had accurately portrayed what they're doing, and to get some picture material. Another team, are the names Rosemary and Peter Grant familiar to you?
No, I don't know those names.
You may know their work without knowing their names. They're evolutionary biologists, and they've been at Princeton all their careers, and they're the ones who spent the past, I must be getting close to 50 years now, for 6 months every year going to Daphne Major Island in the Galapagos to study the finches. And in doing so, they have seen evolution in action and have research that is considered the strongest research in verifying that Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection actually exists, and we can see it working. So I had the privilege of having both Peter and Rosemary read and offer criticism, which is really important to me, of what I had written about them. So that was an amazing experience. I can't wait until this book comes out. I'm really excited, in case you can't tell.
Sounds like really a massive excited. Undertaking.
It's been a massive undertaking. It's been a massive undertaking. It's 22 chapters, and The first 5 are pedagogical. In other words, how do we teach and how do children learn? Or how do we teach so that children will learn? And then the next 17 are all subject matter that range from the birth of the universe to tomorrow's genomics. I ran across a lab in Barcelona where they have the smallest chordate, maybe half a milliliter. I mean, teeny tiny thing that has the same body plan as all other chordates. We are chordates. Anything with a vertebrae is a chordate, and they're working with this infinitesimally small creature that has the smallest genome of any other creature yet discovered, and figuring out from that what it means to have your biosystem so compacted that you are that small. In other words, what do you lose at that when you are that size, and what can we learn from you? And one of the things they're studying right now is the implications for cardiomyopathies, which is problems with the heart muscle. And the other thing they're studying is what is the impact, the direct impact of the pollution in the waters, because this little tiny creature is part of the plankton family that are at the bottom of the food chain. And if we lose the bottom of the food chain, we lose the food chain.
Mm-hmm.
So it's just really important cutting-edge science. And I hope that the readers of the book get as excited as I've been about learning some of these things and get children excited. So that's what I'm doing at the moment.
Thank you. I think this will be my last question.
Yes.
And if you could send a message to the kids who used your computer lab and now they're all grown up, what would you tell them?
Oh, I think I would ask them. I think I'd want to say, do you remember? And if you remember, what do you remember about it? And what does it mean to you at this time in your life, if anything? So I think that I could learn more by asking them things than anything I could possibly tell them.
Okay, fair enough. Thank you, Anne. This is great.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Thank you for digging. I haven't talked about these things in a very, very long time, so thank you for jogging a lot of interesting memories.
If you enjoy these interviews and would like to contribute, make a tax-deductible contribution to the Internet Archive, a nonprofit digital library that has done incredible things to preserve computer history. Make your tax-deductible contribution at archive.org/donate. Thanks.